we've got times for about 10 minutes of Q&A, just to keep you on time. Charles, do you want to join us here on stage? Perfect. And if you've got any last questions, just hold them up, and Sophia and Caitlin will come around and grab them, and we'll put them into the mix. Great. Perfect. So the first one we've got, and I know that it's all on our minds as they meet again tomorrow in Washington. Charles, this one's for you. So if we don't get through the debt ceiling raise, what are you talking to your clients and customers at Wells, and what's your both short and midterm forecast if we actually start to move toward default?
Well, we don't have a forecast. One of the things that's sort of baked into our assumptions for our current macroeconomic forecast is there is a resolution that we do not default in the debt. I think that's still the highest likelihood that happens, even though there's a lot of political things happening, a lot of negotiations, still the most probable outcome. And to be honest, you don't really know or understand what the ramifications would be if that came to pass, where we did default in the debt. So that's sort of uncharted waters. It wouldn't be good. That's all we know. So it's, I think it, I would encourage everybody to, really get behind this this action where we resolve this in short order.
Great. So this is a question for both our regional expert and then our macroeconomist. So one thing that we've noticed, and perhaps accelerated during the pandemic, is that more and more Americans have side gigs or other jobs that they do on the side, that much of their income is being made as 1099ers. To what extent is that transformation in the labor market having an impact both in terms of forecasting, Charles, for thinking about where we're going in terms of macroeconomics? And then Josh, to what extent is that driving or changing how, when you're working with regions and thinking about economic development efforts, how they think about positioning themselves for future success? So Charles, we'll start with you. I mean, is that having any impact in how you're thinking about recession forecasting and growth?
Yeah, it makes it all the more challenging. Over the past few years, this has sort of been an accelerating phenomenon. It's been here for the past few decades. But yeah, it's an incredibly important subsection of the economy, right? Especially here in Southern California, where you have a lot of entrepreneurs, contractors, and people who are not necessarily on an industry payroll. And now you have the one impact of the internet, and you can make an income by selling stuff online, and there's just a lot more options out there for you. And I do think it's having some impact on the current data, right? One reason behind, I showed that labor force participation rate, chart, and I think one thing is there's just you have a whole lot more ways of making money right now, and if I'm being honest, we still don't fully understand, nor do we account for correctly, how that is having an impact. So in many ways, we kind of have to rethink and recalibrate some of the traditional economic models that we have and that we've been relying on, but it's certainly a challenge.
Josh?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we try to do is we look at these labor force kind of participation goals from a macro perspective, but I think one of the things we try to do is look at it from an industry perspective, and I think let me give it a big picture trend, and let's look at it. It's further kind of the demand for that high talent has become even more because they can kind of fill multiple roles. But I think the other part of it for us is we look at it, consulting different regions and kind of economic development activities. What does it mean for each of these different industries, right? And I think you're seeing particularly right now software, that you're actually software engineers that are doing multiple jobs, and they're using AI to do some of their coding for them, and they're able to do, and a lot of that's happening because they can't find the workers that they need, and so they're kind of being forced in the situation. But I will say, it is making some of our analyses about where people live and where people work kind of less useful. So I think we're looking at it from what does it mean for each of these industries, and one of the things too that we see is as they're kind of evolving and changing in terms of their hiring practices, you're probably going to continue to see at some level for some industries more movement in kind of that remote workspace and larger variances between where people live and where they work. Yeah.
Great. Josh, this next question is for you as well. So as you think about decarbonize, and Charles, please weigh in as well as if you have one too. As you think about a decarbonized economy, are there bottlenecks in the labor force and labor supply which really need to be addressed? And here the question sort of refers to similar to the way in which we have high regulatory and barriers to entry for nurses. Are we seeing similar barriers to entry for electricians and other sort of frontline workers in decarbonization?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges that we don't like to talk about, or we don't talk enough about, is transmission and the grid. And workers that are able to expand, because one of the challenges with decarbonizing is that your energy sources come further, the remote areas. Offshore wind, you're going to see in the next 5-6 years a big push to develop offshore wind, and it'll be new technology. So we've got to develop a transmission, and we've got to get transmission workers to build these cables and connections so they can connect to major kind of metropolitan areas. And you're seeing that with solar too. Solar, a lot of the big concentrated solar work is out in the desert in the middle of nowhere. You've got to connect those energy generation spots with where people live. And there's a lot of transmission work, and there's a lot of workers that are going to need to be able to do that. So that's one area. I know, electricians, particularly a lot of the energy efficiency in the building retrofits is an area where they need HVAC technicians, or areas that, so there's going to be a real push in kind of construction and building trades. And the question is, are we going to develop them locally, or are we going to have these people that are going to be kind of moving all around, which I think there's problems with that, because this is very, this is not something, unlike remote work, it's very spatially specific.
Great, perfect. All right, one last question again on green energy for Charles. So Charles, to what extent is your inflation and some of the inflation numbers that we see, obviously some of this is temporary shocks that we've seen, but is some of this baked in terms of the energy as we're seeing this push toward decarbonization and shift, that simply there's costs involved with that change, and that's some of the inflation numbers that we're seeing on the energy side and through the economy?
Maybe a little bit. I think the primary drivers of the recent bout of inflation that we've seen have been mostly associated with the pandemic and the fiscal stimulus, supply chains, and all of the lingering impacts from them. But it is an interesting point, because longer term, I think that does pose sort of like a risk to the upside for inflation, where this transition needs to happen. It's going to happen. We need the workers to do so. It's a very tight labor market, and especially in those industries that were just discussed here. And so that's just an added sort of cost that's associated with it. So if I'm thinking 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line, it's going to happen, and to get it to happen, it might involve higher costs, and higher costs mean more inflation. So overall, the average rate of inflation probably does come down. If I'm thinking of reasons why it might not fully stay at 2%, maybe it's 2.5% or 3%. I think that's true, that it's going to create some pressures, and then I think the Federal Reserve is going to have to kind of come back and say, well, we need to go through this transition for the long-term health of the economy, the globe, everything, the environment. So maybe we have to reconsider like a 2% inflation target. Maybe it's 2.5%, maybe it's 3%. But there's, you got to consider all sides there. So yeah.
Perfect, great. Well, I want to thank our guests. That's the question time we have, so thanks again.